This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Brickell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com or, of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by Annette Davey, whose work includes Pam and Tommy, Why Women Kill, and more recently, The Estate. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I have to ask, now, with The Estate, you have this interesting sort of issue where you have characters that are not likable, but we have to like them or follow them along. So what were the discussions like? Like, how did you go about making these characters someone we want to follow in the cutting room?
Well, fortunately, all of the actors were very good and very likable themselves. So mostly we just talked a lot about how far should we let them go, because being actors, they get excited about doing something kind of fun and a little bit different. So we just sort of tried to figure out the right level of, naughty but sort of fun at the same time, so that you didn't dislike them, but you could maybe enjoy, what they were doing.
So was there a lot of range in the deliveries then, or like in the rushes that you were getting, like from naughty and...
I mean, they were all a little bit different, but particularly, I don't know if I should say this, but like David Duchovny was very into kind of, going as far as he could. So he was one that we had a lot of range with, Each one was different. Rosemary DeWitt was very consistent from what I remember. But they were all really good and really brought a lot to it. Like I said, it was just really a matter of kind of calibrating those things so that, obviously we didn't want them to be unlikable, even though it's kind of a slightly unlikable sort of premise, But I feel like it's also a premise that everybody understands.
Yeah, no, it was that's my question, because when I watched it, I was like, oh, this is interesting because it's essentially people trying to get waiting for someone to die to get their money. So when you get like a script like this, especially for like a comedy, like do you make notes in the margins? How do you like to approach your scripts when you first get them?
I do make some notes. I mean, with The Estate, I feel like I was fortunate in that Dean and he's English, right? And I'm Australian. So I feel like that made it much easier for us, because I feel like as an Australian, we understand the English sense of humor very much so. So I feel like we, really were on the same page in terms of the humor. So we didn't have very many, arguments about what was funny or anything like that. It was really more, how far should we push this? Is this making them unlikable by having them go this far? Is this too crazy, too silly? But I did really feel like we had a very good sort of understanding of the kind of comedy that he writes.
I'm going to interrupt this interview for 1 second. We want to thank PixelView, one of our sponsors. They're a streaming solution for filmmakers. PixelView lets you stream your work to remote clients for easy collaboration, and it works with both on-set teams and post-production teams. With built-in video chat, you can discuss and make changes in real time and stream directly from your editing software. Or you can use the hardware encoder to stream from DaVinci Resolve or the camera on set. See the promo code and the link in the video description below. It's interesting that you would say that, like, as an Australian, because I'm in Canada, and the one thing that people always say is that Canadians are somehow, they get the British sense of humor from, all the British style humor, but then we also have the Americans influencing us, so we have this weird in between. Is there something similar in Australia? Like, do you have another country that influences it, or is it just your own sense of humor?
No, I mean, like, for instance, when I was growing up, most TV shows were probably predominantly English. Now that's quite different. It's probably more predominantly American, I would say. But we would get like the major American shows, but we would get all this sort of the range of English shows. And we used to get a lot of sort of English comedies in particular. So, and I feel like Australians have that kind of self-deprecating humor a lot that the Brits also do. So I would say we have a fairly English sense of humor with a bit of American thrown in, but because you're closer, you might have had more than we did. you know.
Yeah, we get invaded a lot by their television shows.
Like, we didn't have very many American tourists or anything, you know. It was more just that we always had a lot of American movies, but television not quite as much, certainly when I was a kid. But like I said, I think that's pretty much changed now.
So what was your go-to British comedy show?
God, well, you know, I still like, for instance, I loved Absolutely Fabulous and things like that, you know. That really appeals to my sense of humor. It's so insane and so crazy and so over the top, but I found it incredibly funny.
Yeah, it's a great show.
You know what? I've watched it many times over the years, and it's still funny to me. Anyway.
Now, when you're working on a comedy, especially something like The Estate, like a lot, like you were saying, like David Duchovny's taking it one, like his approach and going far, and you have Anna Faris, and you have, you know, all these amazing actors, which is really impressive, actually, the acting. But I'm wondering, because you also have to, when you're working on pacing, and like a lot of comedy comes in with the pacing, and that sort of can be dictated to you by the actor's delivery. So like, what was it like working with their footage and trying to get the pacing down?
Yes, you're right. Comedy is a lot about the pacing. I mean, all of those actors were really good with their timing. Fortunately, Dean shot a pretty good amount of coverage all the time. So if we needed to, we could speed things up or slow things down, depending on what was going on. One thing that we did have on The Estate was we didn't have a very long schedule at all, which in some ways I think maybe is good for comedy, because you weren't really overthinking things, you know. You were sort of really just reacting to what you have in front of you, and, you know, making that as good as you can. And then you didn't have like several months to keep refining it, you know. So in some ways, maybe that was an asset. I've not really thought about that as an advantage before, but we certainly didn't have, you know, we had plenty of time to do everything, but we didn't have like lots of extra time to sort of contemplate and, you know, things like that.
So in the footage, was there a lot of ad-libbing that you had to work with, or was it very tight to the script?
Different actors did different things. Some of them like to ad-lib a lot, and others were very much just the script. So it was kind of a combination. I actually like ad-libbing. I mean, I don't like it all the time, but I think especially in a comedy, you know, if they're on a bit of a roll, they'll often give you something really funny. But, you know, it's really a matter of, does it work? Does it help, you know, with the script and the comedy going forward as much as anything?
So what would you say was one of your tougher scenes to sort of assemble in this, that you, you know, and like what made it so tough?
The toughest scene was probably one of the scenes towards the end when the younger sister is convinced to, you know, sit next to the guy who's, you know, known for exposing himself. And that was mostly tough because it was, you know, we had lots of fantastic performances, especially, again, all of them were ad-libbing quite a lot in that scene. So there was a multitude of ways we could have gone, but it was really about deciding, is this offensive? Is this too far? Things like that. So that's, you know, we probably did more versions of that scene than any other scene in the film, I think. And we had a lot of screenings and a lot of, you know, input from people that we trusted, and, you know, about whether, just sort of how far we should really go in that direction, because we knew it was sort of slightly, I don't know if risque is the right word, but, you know, it's funny, but it's funny probably especially when you're English and you sort of are into that kind of humor, you know. So we didn't want to offend the Americans or anyone else by, you know, by being too kind of going too far, you know.
Yeah. Well, and so like when you're working on something like that, like I think about the scene that really stuck out for me is the where they meet the guy that exposes himself in the room, and like the way it's cut is really interesting because it's this sort of reveal that happens in it. So how did you play that? Because there's, I don't even know how to describe it, but like Anna Faris, there's sort of like this beat where she realizes what they're talking about. So like, how did you work with that footage in that scene?
That was another scene, actually, to be honest, that there were many iterations of. The scene itself on the page was a lot longer than what you see in the film. So again, that was another scene where we were like, how much do we really want to spell this out? Do we really want them to say exactly who this guy is? Or is it better for the audience to kind of, understand it as they understand it? So I think in the end, we mostly went for the audience kind of understanding it as they understand it, which I often think is a really good way to go with a comedy, not tipping them off too soon. And in that scene in particular, I did feel like a little bit of information went a long way. And Dean in particular was very keen to make sure that, I don't know if you remember all this, but there's a lot of reactions of Anna, like reacting to just the kind of physical comedy of, like the room is not very nice. And, he's putting his hands on things and it's kind of dirty. And she puts her hand in some yogurt, I think, at one point. And Dean was very keen on keeping all of that in, but again, trying to make it not, straddle that line of funny, but not like, ooh.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. And then at the end, when they're leaving, they bump into that guy, and there's sort of this little comic beat. Now, I do want to ask about Pam and Tommy. When you're cutting something that's based on like a real world event or something that's happened, like how do you, or I guess, what is it like working with the directors? Like, how do you guys figure out, what to keep and what to not keep? Because you want to respect everyone who's actually happened to, but you also want to tell an interesting, engaging story.
Yeah, that was a really big question that we always talked about a lot during the editing. And I do think the scripts really took that into consideration as well, right from the beginning. I feel like I remember when I first heard about the series, I didn't really know what to think, like what sort of, direction they were going to go in. And then they sent me, I think, the first 5 scripts or something to read. And I was very happy with the way they kind of approached it. It seemed to me like it was very sympathetic, especially towards Pamela. And we did have a lot of discussions about, making sure that we didn't say anything that was kind of like completely unfounded or untrue, and also respecting very much how it felt for her in particular, because I think it was a really big thing for her to have had that. And I had no idea before I started the series that the tape was stolen. Again, growing up in Australia, I just kind of assumed it was, maybe like a Kardashian or something where someone had released it for their own sort of purposes, So I was pretty shocked when I realized that it wasn't like that at all. And everyone was very, very mindful of making sure that it was, accurate, wasn't exploitative in any way, especially like in terms of nudity and stuff. We tried very hard not to, like when they recreated the scenes that were in the tape, everyone was very careful not to go further than what you saw in the tape, things like that.
It's funny that you would say that because I don't remember any nudity in that series. So like I was more engrossed in the story, especially like you said, like the whole theft and how it sort of comes about is very fascinating, and the acting is phenomenal. Specifically, I can't remember the woman's name, but who played Pamela Anderson.
My goodness, Lily James, her name is.
Yeah, like if they ever do a biopic of Pamela, they need to get her.
No, she was incredible, and she's English too, right?
Yeah, I not until like as I was watching, I'm like, who is this? And I like looked it up, and I was like, oh my gosh, she's not even. Yeah,
no, she's not American, and she tended previously to do a lot of like period pieces, like I think she was in Downton Abbey, and she was very much the English Rose a lot of the time. So I thought she did an incredible transformation. And the whole time that I was editing Pam and Tommy, I never called her anything else but Pam. And usually I tend to call the characters by their actors' names. I don't know why, but for some reason, like when I was doing Maid, I always called Margaret rather than Alex, But when I was doing Pam and Tommy, I only ever thought of her as Pam. And it was quite hard for me to sort of switch into calling her Lily.
Yeah, she was very good. Like I was very impressed. Yeah, well, and so when you were tackling that series, which blocks did you do? Which episodes were yours?
I did the first 3, and then I also did the one that's kind of like the standalone episode where Pamela's having the deposition with the lawyers. which I really liked doing because it was very different than a lot of the others. And, you know, I really felt like we really lent into that whole thing about her being a woman and what it was like for her. I mean, just even the physical nature of being in a room with all these male lawyers talking to you about your sex life and looking at a tape that, you know, was of you and your husband having sex, you know. So I felt they really handled that very well. And that was an episode where we did, I think there was more recreations of the sex tape in the episode initially, but everybody felt that they didn't really want to go through that again, you know, that it was enough to talk about it and have all those men asking her all those questions, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think, was so fascinating about the perspective shift on the whole thing, and how it reframes the whole story for Pamela in an interesting way. Now, I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show to watch?
Okay, well, I'm a terrible romantic, so probably my favorite guilty pleasure movie is Out of Africa. And TV, maybe I would say Sex in the City, something like that. You know, I do like a sort of silly, funny kind of thing, and I do love a really good romance, which is pretty funny, but I do love all those big, sweeping kind of, you know, old-fashioned kind of films.
And that's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, and of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching. This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs.